Okay, welcome back and welcome for the first time today. We'll go over kind of briefly what we did yesterday. You didn't miss out on too much and it'll be very easy to get going today. So I'm Reed. I'm going to be teaching the Devs Bootcamp throughout this semester. I'm a senior college computer science major. And for those of you that were here yesterday, you heard my spiel about this is what I am most passionate about, and I'm really excited to be teaching for one more semester. As a recap from yesterday, so for those of you that were here, and to give some context to what we did yesterday, is we built our very first website. And the goal of this was not to understand every single line of code that we wrote, but it was to really get a taste of what we're going to be learning over the next 2 to 3 weeks to start the course. And so I'll remind you that this is what we were able to crank out in less than 45 minutes, which I think is pretty impressive that we were able to build this sort of custom website from scratch in under 45 minutes yesterday. And we did this we had this mock-up I told you that I showed on the screen that we were basing this design off of, and we coded this on Code Sandbox. And so we used code, we'll get into this a little bit later, but we used Code Sandbox yesterday primarily just because it was super easy to get going. Today, in the second half of today, we're going to pivot away from Code Sandbox, and we're actually going to set up some more powerful tooling on our own laptops and use that going forward. But the goal of this yesterday was just to get going as fast as we possibly could. And you'll notice that this was kind of what we created live yesterday as a code along exercise. I'll also show in a little bit how all of the code that we all work on throughout the entire semester will be available to reference, so you can go back and get caught up super easily if you ever miss a class, if you're sick for whatever reason. With that being said, what I want to talk about now is yesterday you kind of followed along. I said we're writing some code in these two files, we're hitting save, let's see what it does just to get that exposure. But today we're going to learn what we actually built. And when I mean that, it all comes down to this question of what actually is a website. So who would like to volunteer a definition of like what a website actually is?
We will see.
I know names. So
Well, do you? Go with it right now.
Tommy, what is a website?
It's a program that runs through a browser.
A program that runs through a browser. Anybody have anything to add on to that? That is correct. There's probably not a wrong answer to this question as long as it's reasonable. What else do we think about a website, Cassidy? A thing in the cloud. We're going to get there. Good point. Yes?
You can like perform different services. You can like find links on the website, then information. You can have like hyperlinks and videos and whatnot.
Yeah, right. Everybody uses websites every single day. Like if you don't, I don't know what you're doing, right? You're using websites every day. So all a website really is that I want us to think about tonight is it's really just a collection of files, okay? So get into this headspace that for tonight we're thinking about a website as a collection of files. And what this is I like to give this analogy that when you open Microsoft Word or Google Docs, you are displaying like the file that you open in Microsoft Word has this like extension like .docx, right? Like when you have this like Microsoft Word file on your computer. And if you go and try and open this Word file, like not in Word, it's gibberish. Like the actual contents of this file, if you try and open it in something other than Word, do not make any sense at all. And it's the same thing. Have you ever tried to like open a PDF file not using a PDF viewer and it doesn't make any sense? It's like scrambled characters and it looks like it means nothing. But the program, Adobe Acrobat, or the program Microsoft Word, is what gives meaning to these files, right? So their respective files, the kinds of files that they're supposed to open, that is what actually displays some information and makes sense to you when you're editing a document or you're previewing a file. And so it's the same thing with a PDF, right? Like it's because that program knows how to read that file that we're able to interact with it. And so the analogy here is that these web page files are the same thing to what an internet browser does, right? So whether that's Chrome, Safari, any browser that you use, these are what make web page files make sense and are parsed, right? And so if we don't have a browser, all web page files are, again, is a bunch of text that looks really ugly. Now this is readable and is also writable as a hint, but this is not what you would expect to see if you went to like youtube.com. You wouldn't expect to see a bunch of lines of code. And we actually wrote this code yesterday, right? So the code that we were writing yesterday is what comprises these web page files. Now, I've purposely spoken broadly. What are web page files? Can someone tell me the two types of files that we did yesterday, that we kind of worked with yesterday? HTML and CSS, right? So yesterday we talked about two of the three main types of web page files. And so every single web page that a browser ever renders is a combination of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. There's only three languages that we're going to focus on, and only three languages that any browser renders. It's HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And I put in parentheses, there's images, right? We saw this yesterday, fonts. These are often referred to as assets. You'll sometimes hear them called like static assets. These basically are just non-code files, but are actually included, like displayed on the site. But the main concept here is that these web page files are just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And yesterday we saw, and I briefly mentioned as we were coding along, that these all serve different functions. So HTML is what you think of as like the bare bones structure of the web pages. They're actually what gives it content. The CSS is what makes the content look how we want it to look, right? So without HTML, a site looks really bad. Or excuse me, without CSS, a site looks really bad. With CSS, it makes that HTML look modern, it spaces it out, and we saw that yesterday creating those rows, adding backgrounds, etc. The one we're going to talk about later on in a couple of weeks is JavaScript. And this is what actually adds extra functionality and makes web pages interactive. So for example, when you click a button, this appears. Or when you click hide, this goes away. Or when you click submit on the form, this is what actually adds your data to a database, right? All of the interactivity we think of on the site is mainly done through JavaScript. And so now we know what these website files are, right? We have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. This is what a web page is. What actually happens when we visit a website, right? Like when you search into your web browser, like youtube.com, let's talk about like what actually happens there. And it's important to understand this when we're thinking about what we're actually creating. So this is us, this is you, and you open Google Chrome or Safari, whatever browser you choose. And somehow the browser renders these website files. So it's akin to a PDF reader opening a PDF file. The browser receives these website files and then displays it on the screen and makes it look all nice for us. But the question here is, what are we missing, right? There's a key step here that I haven't kind of discussed yet, and that's how does the browser actually know what contents to display, right? Like when we go to youtube.com, how does the browser actually know this is the exact HTML and CSS and JavaScript that I want to load to show to me? And the way it actually does this is instead of just immediately knowing these files, it has to request a server, right? So this is this part we talked about, like the website being in the cloud. So what actually happens is you say, I want to go to youtube.com, and your computer talks to a server, and what happens is the server then will return the correct website files. So you can almost think about this as your browser is like downloading these files from a server somewhere. So it's saying, hey, do you have the files for youtube.com? The server is like, yep, here you go. The browser gets those files, and then it renders those files, and then we see what's displayed. And all of this happens in like a second or less generally, right? It's a very quick process. The next question is, how does a server determine what to actually return to the browser, right? And this is where we get into this idea of what's called static versus dynamic websites. And so a static website is one in which no matter who you are, you see the same exact content, right? So this, for example, if you visit google.com and all you expect to see is a search bar and everybody sees that search bar, that would be considered a static file, right? Because the server is giving you back the same file that it would give anyone else back. And so oftentimes you'll hear these are called like content delivery networks or CDNs. And basically what happens here is that whenever a browser requests youtube.com or requests a specific site, no matter who you are, no matter if you're logged in or not, no matter what time of day it is, it'll always respond with the same file or files, right? And then if you guessed it, a dynamic website is one in which the actual HTML and CSS and JavaScript could be different depending on who you are, what time of day it is, what browser you're using, etc. And so the process of this, right, so instead of the server just immediately returning these files to your browser, there could be some extra steps that goes on here. So it could check to see if you're logged in. And if you're logged in, it's going to display maybe your dashboard versus a login form. It may communicate with the database, right? So if think about like when you're on like Instagram or something, it's like showing you your feed. That's different for everybody. Or it may run some sort of machine learning algorithm, right, to generate your feed and the algorithm that everyone likes to talk about. This is all kind of on the server side of things. This isn't really, these functions and these services are what are used to actually make the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And so on a dynamic website, after all this stuff on the server happens, this is when the server will respond with your personal set of files, right? Like what you, the user, based on who you are, should see on the page. And then the same process happens, right? So then the browser goes ahead and renders the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript. Now, the reason I kind of wanted to walk you through this is, has anyone ever heard of like front-end development versus back-end development? So I like to use this diagram because the main distinction is that on the front end is what the user sees and interacts with, right? So this is how the website looks. What happens when they click this button? All of that jazz, like what you are actually interacting with and seeing. And the back end is what goes on behind the scenes, right? So this is where it comes to managing data, determining what gets displayed to the user, determining how to actually set up an API on the back end to know like what database you're communicating with. This is the primary distinction between front end and back end development. And so for the most part in this class, we're going to be focusing on front end development, so making things look nice and focusing directly on what the user will interact with on a website. We'll get into a little bit of backend when it comes to actually interacting with APIs and like how do you actually communicate with a server, because it does depend, like that will depend on what we actually see on the front end. But for the most part, we're not going to be developing any logic for like logging users in. We're not going to be developing our own logic for creating a machine learning algorithm. The main focus will be on actually how do we create good looking sites that have interactivity, but we'll still be using some, we'll tap into a couple back-end things when they come up. Does this make sense? So we're going to be mainly focusing on front-end development. And this is what we did yesterday. So any questions as of now? Please don't be afraid to ask any sort of question.
So how does the website interact with the back end? Like, is it through HTML, CSS, or JavaScript?
That's a great question. Usually that's done using JavaScript. And so what will happen on a normal site is we'll talk about APIs probably in a couple of weeks. But what will happen is from JavaScript, you can actually query for data on at a certain URL, and then whatever that endpoint or that website returns as data to your website, then you can use and process. So it's done using JavaScript.
Okay. So through an API call?
Yeah. And you use JavaScript to make. We'll get into API calls, but JavaScript is what we'll use to make API calls. Good question. Matt, do you want to introduce yourself while we have a minute break?
Sure. To anyone that wasn't here yesterday, I'm Matt. I'm a junior in the college studying math and computer science, and I'm just running devs this semester, so doing all the administrative stuff and looking over all the projects. Feel free to Slack me anytime with any questions.
Cool. What's your favorite language?
Python.
Wrong answer, Matt. Okay.
Networks.
Any other questions? Yes.
Just like about the program, are we going to be getting into PHP or SQL at all?
No.
So one thing on that, if you do want SQL, kind of like our sister club, Hoyalytics does optional trainings for that starting in March. Yeah.
SQL falls definitely into like the back end chunk. But yeah, SQL is also very commonly, like SQL is the backbone of a lot of backends for websites. If there's interest, we could maybe do toward the end, we could do a tiny backend thing with like how to actually set up the route or something. I'm very amenable to tailoring this to what people are most interested in. Okay, so the second half of today, and I hope this doesn't take too long, is actually setting up some tooling, right? So yesterday we used Code Sandbox, and that's what we actually wrote our first website in, and that worked. And Code Sandbox is a great tool. I think it was easy to set up. We got to see the preview of our site. We wrote our code. But yesterday will probably be the last day I used Code Sandbox in class. And that's because we're going to use some more powerful tools and more industry standard tools, right? Yesterday I said that the chief goal of this course is to expose everyone to kind of industry standard technologies, right? So things that if you are interested in computer science and interested in going into software engineering, tools and programs that will be widely used in a variety of disciplines, that is like what companies are actually using. And I hate to break it to a lot of you, but Code Sandbox is generally not what companies are using to write code on larger projects. And so the three things that we're going to do today are we're going to install Git and set up a GitHub account. We're going to install Figma, and then we're going to install VS Code. So if any of you happen to already have any of these things, that's great. But I'm going to make sure that everyone is on the same exact page. So for the next 4 or 5 weeks, we won't need to do this again, right? It'll just be super easy to do it one time today, and we'll be using all of these tools in the coming weeks. So who has heard of Git before? Has anybody heard of Git? Has anybody never heard of Git? That's totally good. Never heard of Git. Wonderful. So Git is a program, it's a software, that it makes it really easy to work on coding projects where you can save what you work on in an organized manner, right? So have you ever like drafted a file or something, saved it, changed it, like save as like new final, like final, and then you have like 3 copies of a file that you insisted were gonna be your final draft or something and they weren't your final draft? So that's sort of the problem that Git solves when working on coding projects. And the word that you'll hear me say a lot is what's called a repository. So a Git repository is a fancy way of saying a folder. This is what, it's a directory on your computer, so it'll be like a folder itself will be a Git repository that contains code, images, subfolders, right? So folders inside of folders. And usually a coding project is structured such that all of the files that are associated to that project are inside of a single repository. So you'll want to you'll put, for example, your index.html file, index.css inside of a Git repository. And as we'll see, we'll have an entire couple of classes dedicated to actually learning the basics of Git, but we'll be using this for a lot of our projects. GitHub is its counterpart, right? So Git is actually like a software on your computer, and GitHub is a website, and it's really, think of it as cloud hosting for coding projects, right? So like very similar to like an iCloud or a OneDrive, except it's dedicated to be used for Git repositories. And so the reason that we're setting this up today is that I will be using a Git repository that's hosted on GitHub as the centralized location to store every lecture, slides, any code we write. I'll like link the YouTube videos directly to there. So all of the stuff from the entire course will be in one location, and it'll conveniently be a GitHub repository to kind of gain familiarity with how to use it. As well as kind of looking toward subsequent semesters, if you like are when you're working on project teams in Hoya Devs, all of our project teams use Git to track changes to files and to work together on adding certain features. So if you do not have a GitHub account, if you go to github.com/join, use your personal email to sign up is my recommendation, just because I don't know like with georgetown.edu how that works like after you graduate or in coming years, and I've always just recommended using your personal email for it. I think
That's probably a good idea because you have the personal and you can just add your
yeah.
school or the Copilot and whatnot.
Yeah. So github.com/join, it should be a pretty easy sign up process. Yeah. So I'm going to give everyone, did anybody already have a GitHub account out of curiosity? Yes, yes, yes. Okay, perfect. So if you already have a GitHub account, totally good. If we're working on getting a GitHub account. Great. What I will show you once we have this GitHub account created is that if you go, I'll drop this link in the Slack channel right now. github.com/Hoya-developers/bootcamp. This link will actually open the GitHub repository that I was just talking about in your browser. So I'll give everyone a minute or two here to, and then I'll kind of explain what we're looking at. Were we able to create accounts okay? That.
Yeah. How do we get there?
In the Slack channel. Are you in the Slack?
I'm not in the Slack.
Okay. What's your net ID?
I am 494.
Oh, it says you are. Is anybody else? Are you in the Slack? Wonderful. But it's just github.com/Hoya-developers/bootcamp. Is everyone on this page? Do we see this page? Yeah, yeah. Emma, you good back there?
What does that mean?
That sounded very convincing.
Speak up.
I've decided to GitHub too many times because I made an account like 3 years ago, and I'm locked out because of that.
That's the thing.
Yeah, it says I've hit too many attempts. Even though I got the password right.
Oh my god.
Yeah, I only did like 4 times. Too.
What's your cooldown?
It doesn't say. It says there's been several failed attempts to sign in from this account or IP address. Please wait a while. We'll try again later.
We'll catch you up after this.
I think you should be able to still actually go to this page. Does it load or not?
Yeah, it loads, but it doesn't load it with I'm like not on an account.
Okay, but you can see this.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So this is the online interface of GitHub, and you'll notice that this sort of looks like if you have File Explorer or Finder, it should look very similar to like what a folder structure looks like. So how I've organized this is that each class I'm going to make a folder. So yesterday's was 01, and then depending on what we do that day, I'll either have like a markdown, a .md file, or I'll actually include like the .html and the .css code from that class. So all I did yesterday was like, if I click on this notes.md file, oh, that's kind of weird. This space is a little bit weird. But just for reference from yesterday, I went ahead and placed the YouTube link from the class and the Code Sandbox link. So if you ever wanted to reference the code from yesterday, all you have to do is come to the Bootcamp repository, go into the proper folder, and there you'll find all the links and all the stuff I talked about. So this is really why the goal is twofold. One, I think it's an easy way to centralize all of the information. And two, I want everybody to gain a little bit of familiarity with GitHub and get comfortable like looking at repositories. We'll have a much more detailed class all about Git and all the joys that Git always brings. But for now, it's more of just getting a little bit familiar with how the actual online interface looks. The next step, so we created a GitHub account. We've seen the Bootcamp repository. The next thing we want to do is actually install Git. So the first thing I want everybody to do is if you're on Windows, open Command Prompt, and if you're on Mac, open Terminal. And if you just type git -- version, actually let me make this a lot. So I open either Command Prompt or Terminal. Throughout the course, I promise my secondary goal is to also, I know it's a software development class, but I will make you proficient on the command line throughout the class, I promise. We'll get into a lot more detail about what the command line actually is if anyone's never or been overwhelmed by the command line. But all I did is went ahead and typed git -- version. Who sees a version displayed? Who sees an error message? Okay. Did it prompt you to install Xcode command line tools when you typed it?
Yes.
Go ahead and install it. Mac is the easy way to install Git. Does anyone have a Windows that doesn't have Git? Okay. You're not alone, I promise. What I've gone ahead and done is in the Bootcamp repository, I've also included, we'll be referencing this in a minute, this O2 file in the notes. For Windows Git setup, it's just a downloadable and then like an installation thing that you like actually install Git with. Did you?
Was it
were you
obvious how to find that?
No.
Yeah, I didn't think it would be either.
Okay, let me go back.
Sorry. Reed just did like 4 clicks and I had no idea what he did.
Okay.
Oh, it's in GitHub.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, I was looking at the wrong one.
And the O2.
So I went to the home page on the repository. O2. The notes markdown file. And then this is just like a downloadable link. In the installer, if it asks you to add the path variable, click yes.